The morning light broke across the horizon like a whispered secret. I'd been in Lancaster County for less than 24 hours, and already the silence had become a character in my story. Welcome after 3 years of Brooklyn's constant percussion. I stood at the window of my rented farmhouse room, coffee mug warming my palms, watching as the world outside slowly unveiled itself in the amber glow of dawn. Evelyn, my elderly landlady, had told me last night about the family next door. The Millers, she'd said, her arthritis-gnarled fingers wrapping a homemade quilt around my shoulders as we sat on the porch. Good Amish folk. Keep to themselves mostly, but kind. They'll help if you need anything. She'd pause then, a knowing look in her eyes. Their youngest son, Eli, he's got a curious spirit. Different, somehow. You might see him around. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now, as I set my empty mug down and pulled on a light jacket to brave the morning chill, I found myself wondering about this neighbor with the curious spirit. The chickens were my first assigned chore, a small price to pay for the drastically reduced rent Evelyn had offered when she learned I was a writer escaping the city to finish my novel. Just gather the eggs each morning, she'd said. My old bones don't bend like they used to. The grass was heavy with dew as I crossed the small field separating Evelyn's modest farmhouse from the chicken coop. The moisture seeped through my canvas shoes, a sensation both uncomfortable and strangely grounding. In New York, the only thing seeping through my shoes had been questionable subway liquids. That's when I saw him. He was kneeling by the chicken coop, his back to me, shoulders moving with practiced efficiency as he scattered feed from a wooden bucket. The rising sun caught him in profile, a strong jaw softened by youth, dark lashes lowered in concentration. His straw hat lay beside him on the ground, revealing hair the color of turned earth, cropped short at the sides, but with enough length on top to catch the morning breeze. Plain clothes marked him instantly as Amish, suspenders over a simple blue shirt, dark pants. But there was nothing plain about the way the early light loved him, gilding his skin and casting him in an almost ethereal glow. I must have made some sound, a caught breath, a misplaced step, because suddenly he turned, and I found myself pinned by eyes the impossible blue of cornflowers. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt strangely caught out, as though I'd been spying on something private rather than simply walking to a chicken coop on borrowed land. Sorry, I managed finally. I didn't mean to startle you. I'm staying with Evelyn. I'm supposed to collect the eggs. He rose in one fluid motion, brushing his hands against his pants. Up close, I could see he was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe 19 or 20 to my 26. His face held the openness of youth, but his eyes, those eyes carried something older. You're the writer, he said. Not a question. I nodded, surprised. News travels fast. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something tentative moving in that direction. Small communities. We don't get many outsiders staying this long. Right. I shifted my weight, suddenly aware of how different I must look to him in my faded jeans and vintage band t-shirt peeking out from my open jacket. I'm Alex, by the way. He nodded once, a small deliberate movement. Eli Miller. So this was the son with the curious spirit. A chicken clucked indignantly nearby, breaking the moment. I gestured toward the coop. I should probably... You'll cut yourself on those shells, he said abruptly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of thin cotton gloves. Here, the hens can be protective. He held them out, and when I reached to take them, our fingers brushed, the contact brief but somehow electric. His eyes met mine for a heartbeat before darting away, that almost smile returning before being carefully tucked away. Thank you, I said, pulling the gloves on. They were still warm from his pocket. I'll show you. He moved toward the coop door, and I followed, watching the ease with which he navigated the small space, reaching beneath irritable hens with gentle confidence. Like this, he demonstrated, his movements deliberate, pedagogical. Slow and steady, they know when you're nervous. I tried to mimic his motions, but when I reached beneath the first hen, she pecked sharply at my gloved hand. I jerked back with a curse that immediately made me flush with embarrassment. Eli's eyes widened slightly at my language, But then something remarkable happened. He laughed. It was a small sound, quickly controlled, but it transformed his face completely. Suddenly, he wasn't just handsome in that classical, sculptural way. He was beautiful. Sorry, I muttered, embarrassed both by my failure and my language. Don't be, he said, and there was warmth in his voice I hadn't heard before. Here, try again. I'll help. He moved behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him against my back, and gently guided my hand with his own. Like this, he said softly, his breath warm against my ear. Confident, but gentle. Together our hands slipped beneath the hen, who clucked but didn't peck. When we withdrew, a perfect brown egg rested in my palm. There, he said, stepping back, and I immediately felt the absence of his warmth. You'll learn. I placed the egg carefully in the basket he handed me. It seems I've got a good teacher. Something flickered across his face then, a shadow, a question, I couldn't tell which. He retrieved his hat from the ground, settling it on his head with practiced ease. I should go, he said. My father will be wondering where I am. Of course. I wanted to say more, to hold him there somehow, but I had no reason to. Thanks for the help. He nodded once, turned to leave, then paused. Without looking back at me, he said, I'm usually here at dawn, to feed the chickens. Then he was gone, striding across the field toward the larger farm beyond, his back straight, his pace unhurried but purposeful. I stood watching him longer than I should have, the basket with its single egg hanging from my fingers, wondering about the unasked questions in those cornflower eyes. By midday, the late August heat had transformed the air into something tangible, thick with humidity and the sweet scent of ripening corn from the surrounding fields. I'd spent the morning attempting to write, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, my mind kept wandering to that moment in the chicken coop, the gentle pressure of Eli's hand guiding mine, the unexpected warmth of his laugh. When the cursor on my laptop screen had blinked accusingly at me for over an hour, I finally gave up and decided to explore the property. Evelyn had mentioned a small library of old books in the converted barn behind the house. Perhaps I'd find inspiration there. I was crossing the side yard when I noticed him again. Eli was working at the fence line that separated Evelyn's property from his family's farm, replacing a broken board. His movements were economical, practiced. He'd removed his hat and outer shirt in the heat, working in just a white undershirt that clung to his shoulders with sweat. The sight made my steps falter. He must have sensed my presence because he turned, shielding his eyes against the sun to look at me. For a moment, I considered pretending I hadn't seen him, continuing on my way to the barn. But something pulled me toward him instead. Need a hand? I called as I approached. He considered me for a moment before nodding. An extra set of hands would help, he admitted. As I drew closer, I could see the work he'd already completed. Several fence boards replaced, the new wood pale against the weathered gray of the older pickets. Hold this steady, he instructed, positioning a new board. I gripped it while he reached for his hammer, our shoulders nearly touching in the process. Your grandmother mentioned you're writing a book, he said, his focus on the nails he was positioning. She's not actually I began, then stopped. Yes, trying to anyway. What's it about? He asked, driving the first nail home with 3 precise strikes. The question caught me off guard. I'd grown used to people's eyes glazing over when I mentioned I was a writer, their interest extending only as far as asking if I'd written anything they might have heard of. It's about belonging, I said finally. A man who spent his life trying to fit into spaces that weren't made for him. Eli paused, hammer poised for the next nail. And does he find where he belongs? Our eyes met, and something unspoken passed between us. A current of understanding that made my skin prickle with awareness. I don't know yet, I admitted. I'm still figuring that out. He nodded as if this made perfect sense, then returned to his work. We fell into a rhythm, me holding boards steady, him securing them with swift, sure hammer strikes. The physical labor felt good after months of hunching over my laptop, and I welcomed the simple focus it required. Have you always lived here? I asked after a while, breaking our comfortable silence. Born here, he confirmed. 5th generation on this land. I tried to imagine it, knowing your place in the world with such certainty, your future as clearly defined as the straight rows of corn in the surrounding fields. And you've never wanted to leave. See more of the world. The question slipped out before I could consider its implications. His hand stilled momentarily. That's not our way. But have you wanted to? I pressed, suddenly needing to know. He reached for another nail, rolling it between his fingers before positioning it. Wanting doesn't change what is, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I fell silent, sensing I'd crossed some invisible boundary. We worked without speaking for several minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic strike of hammer on nail and the distant lowing of cattle. When he finally broke the silence, his question surprised me. Why did you come here? To Lancaster, I mean. There must be quieter places closer to New York. I considered deflecting with something easy, the cheap rent, the picturesque setting good for inspiration. But the genuine curiosity in his eyes pulled something more honest from me. I needed to disappear for a while, I said. The city, it got too loud. Not just the noise, but everything. The expectations. The constant performance of being someone people wanted me to be. I smiled ruefully. That probably sounds ridiculous to you. No, he said simply. It doesn't. He reached for the hammer again, and this time when I handed it to him, our fingers touched, a brief contact that sent heat coursing up my arm. His eyes met mine, held for a beat too long, then deliberately shifted away. One more board, he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. As we finished the repair, I found myself hyper-aware of every movement he made, every accidental brush of his arm against mine. The air between us felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. When we finished, he stepped back to survey our work. Sweat had darkened his hair at the temples, and a smudge of dirt marked his cheek. The urge to reach out and wipe it away was so strong I had to clench my fists against it. Thank you for the help, he said formally, as if suddenly remembering who I was. Who he was. Anytime, I replied, meaning it more than I should have. He nodded once, replaced his hat, and gathered his tools. I should get back. There's more work to be done before sundown. I watched him walk away, his stride purposeful, shoulders straight beneath his once again properly buttoned shirt. Only when he disappeared into the barn across the field did I release the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Evening brought a merciful cooling of the air. After a simple dinner with Evelyn, who regaled me with stories of the farm's history, I found myself restless, unable to focus on writing or reading. There's a well on the east side of the property, Evelyn mentioned as she cleared our plates. Just past the old oak. The water's sweet there. Best drinking water in the county. Take a mason jar if you'd like to try it. The suggestion of a walk was welcome, so I grabbed a jar from the shelf she indicated and headed out into the gloaming. The path to the well was well-worn, but narrower than I expected, winding through a small copse of trees before opening to a clearing where the stone-encircled well stood. I wasn't alone. Eli sat on the well's edge, his back to me, shoulders slightly hunched as he gazed into the water below. In the fading light, with his profile outlined against the darkening sky, he looked like a figure from another time. I considered retreating, giving him his privacy, but some noise, a twig snapping underfoot perhaps, alerted him to my presence. He turned, and even in the gathering darkness, I could see recognition dawn in his eyes. Evelyn sent me for water, I explained, holding up the jar. He nodded. It's good water. I approached cautiously, as if he were some wild creature that might startle and flee. May I? He shifted slightly, making room for me on the stone rim. I sat, leaving careful space between us, and placed the jar beside me. I come here sometimes, he said after a moment, his voice quiet in the evening stillness. To think. Am I intruding? He shook his head. No. We sat in silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Crickets began their nightly chorus around us, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Why did you really choose the country? He asked suddenly. Someone like you could go anywhere. The question caught me off guard, not just its directness, but the assumption behind it. Someone like me? He gestured vaguely with one hand. educated, free to move through the world. There was something in his tone I couldn't quite place. Not envy exactly, but a kind of wistful curiosity. I told you before, I said. I needed to escape the noise. But why here? Why not some cabin in the mountains or a beach somewhere? I considered the question seriously, looking for the truth beneath my own easy answers. I think I wanted to see a different way of living, one with clearer purposes, clearer boundaries. I looked at him, one where people know who they are and where they belong. He was quiet for so long, I thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. And if who you are doesn't fit where you belong? The question hung between us, fragile and dangerous. I sensed we weren't talking about me anymore. I don't know, I admitted. That's what I'm trying to figure out. He nodded slowly, his eyes on the darkening horizon. My father says certainty is a gift from God. That doubt is the devil's whisper. He traced a pattern on the stone with his finger. But sometimes I think doubt is just another kind of truth. The confession felt enormous coming from him, a hairline crack in the perfect facade of obedience he presented to the world. I wanted to pry it wider, to see what lay beneath, but I sensed the fragility of the moment. Instead, I asked, "What do you think about when you come here alone?" He drew a deep breath, held it, then released it slowly. "Things I shouldn't," he said simply. Our eyes met in the gathering darkness, and the air between us seemed to compress, heavy with unspoken words. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, could see the slight movement of his throat as he swallowed. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, until he broke it by reaching for the rope to draw water from the well. "You came for water," he said, his voice steadier now as he lowered the bucket. I watched his hands work the rope, strong hands, calloused from labor, but capable of such gentleness as I'd witnessed that morning with the eggs. I thought of those hands on my skin and felt heat rise to my face, grateful for the concealing darkness. When he had filled my jar, he handed it to me carefully, ensuring our fingers didn't touch. "It's getting late," he said. "My family will be wondering where I am." I nodded, clutching the jar like a lifeline. "Thank you for the water." "Alex," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded different somehow, weighted with meaning I couldn't decipher. "Be careful here. This isn't your world." Before I could respond, he'd turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees like a ghost, leaving me with the distinct impression I'd been both warned and invited. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying our conversations, searching for meanings within meanings, dissecting every glance, every carefully chosen word. He wears obedience like armor, and I want to break through it. The thought came unbidden, shameful in its selfishness, its disregard for what such a breach might cost him. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and moved to the window seat in my room, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. From this vantage point, I could just make out the dark shape of the Miller farm, all lights extinguished at their early hour. What was he doing now? Sleeping peacefully in a simple room, untroubled by the turbulent thoughts that plagued me? Or was he, too, staring into the darkness, thinking of forbidden things? The next morning, I rose before dawn. I told myself it was to get a head start on writing, but even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. I was hoping to see him again. The chickens provided my excuse. I slipped out into the pearly pre-dawn light, dew soaking my shoes just as it had the day before, and made my way to the coop. My heart sank when I found it empty. No Eli kneeling with his bucket of feed, no moment of connection waiting to unfold. I went about the task alone, using the techniques he'd shown me, half expecting him to appear at any moment. But the only sounds were the disgruntled clucking of the hens and the distant call of a rooster announcing the new day. By the time I finished gathering eggs, the disappointment sat heavy in my chest. I'd built an entire narrative in my head, invested meaning in what were probably just polite interactions from a young man raised to be helpful. I was turning to leave when I heard footsteps behind me. "You're getting better at that," Eli said, and the sound of his voice sent a ridiculous surge of joy through me. "The chickens aren't complaining as much." I turned to find him standing a few feet away, feed bucket in hand, watching me with those impossible blue eyes. Today, he wore a dark green shirt beneath his suspenders, and the color made his eyes seem even more vivid. "I had a good teacher," I replied, hoping my voice sounded normal. Something like pleasure flickered across his face before he looked down at the bucket in his hands. "I'm late today. My youngest sister was ill in the night." "I'm sorry to hear that. Is she all right?" He nodded. "Just a fever. My mother is tending to her." There was an awkward pause, neither of us seeming to know what to say next. Finally, I held up my basket. "Well, the eggs are collected. I should let you get to your work." I made to step past him, but he reached out suddenly, his hand catching my arm. "Wait." The touch sent electricity crackling along my skin. He must have felt it too, because he withdrew his hand quickly, as if ginned. He started, then stopped, looking frustrated with himself. "I wondered if you might... That is, there's a problem with one of our barn doors. The hinge is broken. I could use some help fixing it." It wasn't what he'd originally meant to say. That much was clear from his hesitation. But I nodded eagerly, too hungry for his company to question it. "Of course. When?" "After supper?" he suggested. "When the day's work is done." "I'll be there," I promised. He nodded once, that same small, deliberate movement I was coming to recognize as characteristically his. "I'll meet you by the well, around 8. With that, he turned to his work, and I left him to it, my steps lighter than they had been moments before, anticipation building in my chest for the evening to come. The day stretched interminably. I tried to write, managed a few pages that I'd probably delete later, then gave up and spent the afternoon helping Evelyn with chores around the farmhouse. The physical labor was welcome. It kept my hands busy even as my mind continued its relentless circling around thoughts of Eli. Finally, as the sun began its descent, Evelyn and I sat down to a simple supper of vegetable soup and homemade bread. I tried not to rush through the meal, to be present with this kind woman who had opened her home to me. But my attention kept drifting to the clock on the wall. "You seem distracted tonight," Evelyn observed, her eyes sharp despite her years. "Just thinking about my book," I lied, immediately feeling guilty. She made a non-committal sound that suggested she didn't believe me but wouldn't press. "I knew a boy like you once," she said instead, her gaze drifting to the window, full of fire and questions. "Never still." I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I focused on finishing my soup. "Be careful with your fire, Alex," she said after a moment. "Not everything is meant to burn." The cryptic warning sent a chill through me. Before I could ask what she meant, she'd changed the subject, telling me about plans to preserve the late summer tomatoes from her garden. At 10 to 8, I excused myself, claiming I wanted to take a walk before settling in to write. Evelyn's knowing look followed me out the door, but she said nothing. The evening air was soft against my skin as I made my way to the well, my pulse quickening with each step. Part of me expected to find the clearing empty, to discover that I'd somehow imagined the morning's invitation. But as I rounded the final bend in the path, I saw him. Eli stood beside the well, his back to me, silhouetted against the sunset-stained sky. He'd changed his clothes, the green shirt replaced by a clean white one that glowed in the fading light. "Hey," I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and the look on his face, a mixture of relief and something like fear, made my breath catch. "You came," he said. "Of course." He nodded, looking down at his hands before meeting my eyes again. "The barn door," he said. "It's this way." I followed him across the fields, through a gap in the fence we'd repaired together, and toward the large barn that stood some distance from the main farmhouse. The walk was silent, but not uncomfortably so. It felt like we were both gathering courage for something, though what exactly I couldn't say. The barn door was indeed hanging awkwardly, its top hinge clearly broken. Eli reached for a lantern hanging nearby, lit it with practiced ease, and handed it to me. "Hold this," he instructed, then moved to examine the damage more closely. I watched him work, the lantern casting his face in warm golden light, throwing dramatic shadows across his features. He was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, all clean lines and quiet strength. "Where is everyone?" I asked, suddenly aware of how alone we were. Prayer meeting at the bishop's house, he replied, not looking up from the hinge. My mother stayed home with Leah, my sister, and I told them I needed to finish some work here. The implication was clear. He'd arranged for us to be alone. The realization sent a thrill of anticipation through me that I tried to suppress. Can you hold the door steady? He asked, reaching for a hammer and some nails from a nearby workbench. I did as asked, our bodies necessarily close as we worked together to realign the heavy door. I could smell the clean scent of him, soap and fresh air, and something uniquely his. It was intoxicating. We worked in focused silence for several minutes until the door was hanging properly again. When the task was done, instead of stepping back, Eli remained close, his eyes on the repaired hinge, but his body still near enough that I could feel the heat of him. Thank you, he said softly. Anytime, I replied, just as I had the day before at the fence. He turned then, and we were standing face to face, close enough that I could see the individual lashes framing his eyes, the slight flush on his cheeks. There's something I want to show you, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Up there. He nodded toward a ladder leading to the hayloft. My heart raced as I followed him up the wooden rungs, the lantern clutched in one hand. The loft was warm and sweet-smelling, golden hay piled in neat bales around a clear central space. Eli took the lantern from me, hanging it on a hook where it cast long shadows across the wooden beams above. I come here sometimes, he said, his voice low, when I need to be alone. I looked around, trying to imagine him here in solitude, thinking his forbidden thoughts. It's peaceful, I offered. He nodded, moving to sit on one of the hay bales. After a moment's hesitation, I joined him, careful to leave space between us. I've never let anyone up here before, he confessed, not looking at me. This is my place, just mine. The significance of the admission wasn't lost on me. Thank you for sharing it. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the lantern's dancing flame. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet, I had to lean closer to hear him. Do you ever feel like you're living inside a glass box? You can see everything outside, but you can't reach it? Can't touch it? The vulnerability in his voice made my throat tight. Yes, I said simply. I know exactly what that feels like. He turned to me then, really looked at me, and I saw something break open in his expression. Fear giving way to determination. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and traced a line down my forearm with one finger, the touch so light it might have been my imagination. What are you thinking right now? He asked, his fingers still resting against my skin. The honest answer felt too dangerous to voice. Instead, I asked, What are you thinking? He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to where his finger connected with my arm. That I'm breaking every rule I've ever been taught, he whispered, and that I don't want to stop. The confession hung between us, fragile and momentous. In the lantern light, his face was a study in contrasts, strength and vulnerability, certainty and doubt, desire and fear. Stay with me for a minute, he said, his voice barely audible. Just here, with me. My breath caught as he leaned closer, the lantern flame flickering wildly as if in response to the electricity between us. His eyes, those impossible blue eyes, searched mine, asking a question I was afraid to answer. Eli, I breathed, not knowing if I was warning him away or drawing him closer. His hand moved from my arm to my face, fingers trembling slightly as they traced the line of my jaw. Time seemed to slow, stretch, suspend between one heartbeat and the next. And then, the lantern flickered, casting his face in shadow. The lantern flickered, casting shadows across his face as his fingers trembled against my jaw. For a heartbeat, we hung suspended in that fragile moment, his eyes searching mine, asking a question neither of us dared speak aloud. Then, the barn door creaked below, and reality came crashing back. Eli jerked away, his eyes wide with alarm. Someone's coming, he whispered, instantly on his feet. I scrambled up beside him, heart hammering against my ribs. What do we... Eli, a woman's voice called from below. Bist du do? Hey, Mum, he whispered. My mother, I'll go down. Stay here. Silent. Before I could respond, he was moving swiftly to the ladder, descending with practiced quiet. I pressed myself against the wall of the loft, hidden in shadows, holding my breath as I listened to their conversation below. Ich bin da, ma'am, I heard Eli say, his voice steady, despite what had nearly transpired moments before. They spoke in Pennsylvania Dutch, their words incomprehensible to me. But I could hear the questioning tone in his mother's voice, the careful reassurance in his replies. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the barn door close, and seconds later, Eli's head appeared at the top of the ladder. You need to go, he said, his voice a harsh whisper. Now! Leah's fever has worsened. The family is returning early. I nodded, moving quickly to the ladder. As I passed him, I couldn't help but search his face, looking for some acknowledgement of what had nearly happened between us. But his expression was closed, shuttered in a way I hadn't seen before. Eli, I began. Not now, he cut me off, but his tone was gentle. Please, just go. I slipped down the ladder and across the barnyard, my mind still reeling from the intensity of our almost moment. Only when I reached the safety of Evelyn's farmhouse did I realize I was trembling. That night, sleep evaded me entirely. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of our time in the loft. The tender way he'd traced my arm, the vulnerability in his eyes when he'd asked me to stay with him. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't been interrupted. More than that, I couldn't stop thinking about what it meant, for him, for me, for whatever this fragile thing was growing between us. The consequences for me were negligible. I was just passing through. But for Eli, his entire world hung in the balance. Dawn found me hollow-eyed and restless. I slipped out of the house before Evelyn stirred, needing air, needing movement to quiet my racing thoughts. Without conscious intention, my feet carried me toward the chicken coop, though I knew it was too early even for Eli's morning chores. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the world washed in that peculiar pre-dawn gray that makes everything seem both more and less real. I was so lost in thought that at first I didn't notice the figure in the small goat pen adjacent to the chicken coop. Eli stood amid a small herd of goats, scattering feed from a bucket. His hair was damp, as if freshly washed, and he wore a clean shirt the color of fresh cream. The fabric stretched across his shoulders as he moved, and I found myself unable to look away. A goat nudged his leg, and he laughed softly, the sound carrying across the still morning air. The gentle intimacy of the moment, this boy surrounded by animals that trusted him, his face unguarded in the privacy of dawn, made my chest ache with longing. I must have made some sound, because suddenly he looked up, his eyes finding mine across the dewy grass. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he set down his bucket and walked to the edge of the pen. You're up early, he said, his voice careful, neutral. Couldn't sleep, I admitted. He nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Wait here. He disappeared into a small shed attached to the goat pen, emerging moments later with a tin cup in his hand. Steam rose gently from the liquid inside. Warm cider, he explained, offering it to me through the fence. From last fall's apples, my mother preserves it. I reached for the cup, and our fingers brushed, deliberately, I thought, though I couldn't be certain. The warmth of the cider seeped through the metal into my palms, but it was nothing compared to the heat that flared where our skin had touched. Thank you, I said, taking a careful sip. The cider was sweet with just a hint of spice, warming me from the inside out. You were gone when I came back up to the loft, he said quietly, watching me drink. You told me to go, I reminded him. I know. He looked down, fidgeting with the fence post. I just thought you might have waited in the shadows. I studied his face, trying to read what lay beneath his careful expression. Would you have wanted me to? His eyes met mine, and in them I saw the same vulnerability I'd glimpsed in the loft. Yes, he whispered. The admission hung between us, delicate as morning mist. A small goat approached, bleating softly, and butted against Eli's leg. He reached down absently to scratch behind its ears, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're good with them," I observed, gesturing to the goats. "They're easier than people," he replied. "They don't expect anything except kindness." The statement seemed to hold more weight than its simple words suggested. I took another sip of cider, letting the warmth of it settle my nerves. "About last night," I began. "My sister's better," he interrupted, as if afraid of what I might say. "The fever broke around midnight." I nodded, accepting his deflection. "I'm glad." We stood in silence for a moment, the space between us charged with unspoken words. Finally, I handed the cup back through the fence. "I should help Evelyn with breakfast," I said, "though she wouldn't be awake for another hour at least." He took the cup, his fingers deliberately brushing mine again. "Will you be working on your book today?" "I should," I replied, "though I haven't been very productive lately." Something like a smile tugged at his lips. "Distractions?" "Something like that." His eyes held mine for a long moment, and I felt that same electric current passing between us. Then he glanced over his shoulder toward the farmhouse, his expression growing serious. "Meet me at the creek," he said, his voice low and urgent, "the one that runs behind the south field. After midday." My heart skipped. "Won't your family wonder where you are?" "I'll tell them I'm checking the fence line. It's my responsibility anyway." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the excitement coursing through me. "I'll be there." A soft laugh escaped him then, like a bird suddenly taking flight. "This is madness," he said, but there was no regret in his voice, only a kind of wondering. "The best kind," I replied, and was rewarded with another laugh, this one fuller, less restrained. "Go," he said, his eyes bright with something I'd never seen in them before. "Before someone sees." I went, but I could feel his gaze following me all the way back to Evelyn's house. Breakfast with Evelyn passed in a blur. She chatted about her plans for the day, canning peaches from the orchard, mending a torn quilt, while I nodded and responded on autopilot, my mind entirely occupied with thoughts of meeting Eli at the creek. "You're a million miles away this morning," she observed, passing me a plate of scrambled eggs. "That book of yours must be taking an interesting turn." I felt a flush creep up my neck. "Something like that." Her eyes were shrewd but kind. "Just remember what I told you about fire, Alex. Some things aren't meant to burn." I looked up, startled by the echo of her previous warning. "What do you mean by that?" She sighed, setting down her fork. "I've lived here 63 years. I've watched generations of Miller children grow up across that fence. They're good people, living by their own lights." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But their world isn't yours. Their choices aren't yours to make." My appetite vanished. "Evelyn, I'm not blind, child." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I see how you look toward their farm, how you find reasons to be near the fence line. I see who you're watching." I set my fork down with a shaking hand. You don't need to explain yourself to me," she interrupted. "I'm just saying, be careful, not just with yourself, but with him. Those people take their ways seriously. Breaking them has consequences." I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I understand." "Do you?" she asked, her voice suddenly sad. "I hope so. I truly do." The rest of breakfast passed in uncomfortable silence. After helping with the dishes, I retreated to my room, ostensibly to write, but in reality to watch the clock crawl toward midday. When I couldn't stand it any longer, I grabbed my notebook and told Evelyn I was going to look for inspiration by the creek. The knowing look she gave me made my stomach twist with guilt, but I pushed it aside. I was a grown man. So was Eli. Whatever was happening between us was our business alone. The creek was exactly where Eli had described, a small, clear stream running through a copse of willow trees at the southern edge of the Miller property. I settled on a fallen log, listening to the gentle babble of water over stones, and tried to calm my racing heart. I didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, I heard footsteps approaching through the tall grass. Eli appeared between the willows, his straw hat in his hands, his face flushed from hurrying. "You came," he said, as if he'd been afraid I wouldn't. "Of course I did." He looked behind him, as if checking to make sure he hadn't been followed, then turned back to me with a smile that transformed his face. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, taking a step closer. "All morning." The simple confession sent warmth spreading through my chest. "I've been thinking about you too. Since the moment I first saw you." His eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by my directness. Then he moved to sit beside me on the log, close enough that our shoulders brushed. "I've never felt this way before," he said quietly, turning his hat in his hands. "It's frightening." "Frightening," I echoed, turning to face him. He nodded, not meeting my eyes. "I was taught to fear feelings like this." His voice trembled slightly. "But I can't hide what I feel for you." The admission hung between us, momentous and fragile. I reached out, hesitating just before touching his hand. "Eli, if we're found, you'll lose your family. That I know, but I'd lose it all to be yours." He cut me off gently, finally looking up, his eyes filled with a certainty that took my breath away. "You don't know what you're saying," I whispered, even as my heart soared at his words. "Your whole life is here, your community, your beliefs." "I know exactly what I'm saying," he interrupted, his voice stronger now. "I've lived my whole life by rules made by others, doing what's expected, being who they want me to be." He took a deep breath. "But with you, for the first time, I feel like myself, like I can breathe." I didn't know what to say to that. The weight of his confession, the responsibility it placed on me, was almost too much to bear. "We've only known each other a few days," I reminded him gently. "And how long does it take to recognize truth?" he asked, his gaze direct and unwavering. "How long did it take you to know this was different?" I couldn't argue with that. From the moment I'd seen him kneeling by the chicken coop, something had shifted inside me, as if a key had turned in a lock I hadn't known existed. "The creek is beautiful here," I said, changing the subject because I couldn't bear the intensity of the moment. "Do you come here often?" He allowed the deflection, though I could see the slight disappointment in his eyes. "Since I was a child, it's one of my favorite places." "Another secret spot?" I teased gently. He smiled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "One of many. Would you like to see the best part?" I nodded, and he stood, offering his hand to help me up. I took it, savoring the warmth of his palm against mine, the strength in his fingers. He didn't let go as he led me downstream, through a curtain of willow branches, to where the creek widened into a small, clear pool. "The swimming hole," he explained, dropping my hand to sweep his arm toward the water. "My brothers and I used to come here on hot summer days." The pool was beautiful. Crystal clear water revealing smooth stones on the bottom, dappled sunlight dancing across the surface. Without warning, Eli began unbuttoning his outer shirt. "What are you doing?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "It's hot," he said simply, shrugging out of the shirt to reveal his thin white undershirt beneath. "And the water's perfect." He sat on a rock to remove his boots and socks, then stood in just his undershirt and trousers, held up by suspenders. The sight of him, so much less formal than I'd ever seen him, made my heart race. "Are you coming in?" he asked, pausing at the water's edge. I hesitated only briefly before rolling up my sleeves and pant legs. "Just to cool off," I agreed, kicking off my shoes. The water was shockingly cold against my feet, making me gasp. Eli laughed at my reaction, a free, unguarded sound that I wanted to hear again and again. "City boy," he teased, splashing water in my direction. "Hey," I protested, splashing back. What followed was a childish but joyful battle, water flying between us as we laughed and dodged each other's attacks. Eli moved with unexpected grace, his body lithe and quick despite his workman's build. I found myself mesmerized by the play of sunlight on his wet skin, the way his undershirt clung to his chest, revealing the contours beneath. When we finally exhausted ourselves, we stood facing each other in knee-deep water, both breathing hard, droplets running down our faces. "I've never seen you like this," I said, taking a step closer to him. Like what? He asked, his voice softening. Free, I answered honestly. Happy. Something flickered in his eyes, sadness perhaps, or yearning. I'm happy, he said quietly. Right now, with you, I'm happier than I've ever been. The confession hung between us, as tangible as the droplets of water clinging to his eyelashes. I moved closer, drawn by some invisible force, until I could feel the heat radiating from his body despite the cool water surrounding us. Eli, I whispered, his name a prayer on my lips. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes. A question, an invitation. I nodded, almost imperceptibly, and then his hand was on my cheek, trembling slightly as it had in the loft. We moved to the edge of the pool, stepping onto the grassy bank beneath the swaying branches of a willow tree. The filtered sunlight cast dappled shadows across his face as he stood before me, his eyes wide and vulnerable. I've never... he began, then stopped, a flush spreading across his cheekbones. We don't have to, I started, but he silenced me by placing a finger against my lips. I want to, he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. I've wanted to since I first saw you. He moved his hand to cup my cheek, his touch gentle as if I were something precious that might break. I mirrored his gesture, my palm against the smooth skin of his face, feeling the slight stubble beginning to form along his jaw. Time seemed to slow as he leaned in, his eyes fluttering closed. The first brush of his lips against mine was hesitant, questioning. A whisper of a kiss that sent electricity coursing through my veins. When I didn't pull away, he pressed forward with more confidence, his mouth soft and warm against mine. The kiss was innocent at first, tender, exploratory, but quickly deepened as instinct took over. My hands moved to his waist, pulling him closer, while his slid into my hair, cradling my head as if it were something precious. A soft sound escaped him, half sigh, half moan, as his lips parted beneath mine. The world around us seemed to fall away, narrowing to just this moment, just this connection between us. The sweet taste of him, the heat of his body pressed against mine, the gentle movement of his hands. It was everything I hadn't known I was longing for. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, eyes closed, as if to savor the lingering sensation. Alex, he whispered, my name a benediction on his lips. I opened my eyes to find him looking at me with such naked emotion that it made my chest ache. Joy, fear, desire, uncertainty, all written plainly across his beautiful face. I've never felt anything like that, he admitted, his voice hushed with wonder. I brushed a drop of water from his cheek, letting my fingers linger against his skin. Neither have I. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, erasing the careful reserve he usually maintained. Truly? Truly, I confirmed, and it wasn't a lie. I'd had relationships before, kisses and more, but nothing that had made me feel as I did in this moment, as if my entire being had been recalibrated around this one person, this one connection. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. I'd come to Lancaster to escape, to find quiet in which to write my book. Instead, I'd found something, someone, that threatened to turn my carefully constructed solitude upside down. Eli must have sensed the shift in my mood, because he pulled back slightly, studying my face. What's wrong? I shook my head, unwilling to break the spell of the moment with practical concerns. Nothing, just taking it all in. He accepted this with a nod, though I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. We should dry off, he said, glancing at our wet clothes. The sun is warm here. We settled on the grassy bank, letting the dappled sunlight dry our clothes as we lay side by side, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of each other. The willow branches swayed above us, creating a private world of shifting shadows and golden light. Tell me about your life, Eli said after a comfortable silence. In the city. I turned my head to look at him, surprised by the request. What do you want to know? Everything, he said simply. What you do each day, who your friends are, what makes you laugh. So I told him about my tiny apartment in Brooklyn with the fire escape that doubled as my summer reading nook. About my job as a copywriter that paid the bills while I worked on my novel. About my friends. Sadie with her collection of vintage typewriters. Marcus, who could quote entire Shakespeare plays from memory. Delia, whose apartment was filled with plants named after dead authors. He listened with rapt attention, asking questions about things I took for granted. Subway systems, coffee shops, bookstores that stayed open until midnight. I found myself seeing my life through his eyes, recognizing the privileges and possibilities I'd never fully appreciated. "It sounds noisy," he said finally, "but beautiful in its way." "It is," I agreed. "Both those things." A comfortable silence fell between us again, broken only by the gentle babble of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "What about you?" I asked eventually. "Tell me about your life here." His expression grew thoughtful. "It's ordered, predictable. We rise before dawn, work until dusk. There are rules for everything: how to dress, how to speak, who to love." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "Who not to love?" The implications hung heavy between us. I reached for his hand, threading our fingers together. "They'll shun you," I said softly. "If they find out, I won't let that happen." He turned to look at me, his eyes fierce despite the gentleness of his touch. "Then don't let it." Before I could respond, he leaned over and kissed me again. Deeper this time, more certain. I responded instantly, pulling him closer, losing myself in the taste and feel of him. When we finally broke apart, the sun had shifted position, casting longer shadows through the willow branches. Eli sat up suddenly, looking at the angle of light. "I need to go," he said, regret clear in his voice. "They'll be expecting me back soon." I nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in my chest at the thought of him leaving. "When can I see you again?" He hesitated, clearly calculating risks and opportunities. "Tomorrow morning, at the chicken coop?" "I'll be there," I promised. He smiled, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my forehead. "Until then." We dressed properly, helping each other straighten clothing and brush away bits of grass. As we prepared to leave our secluded spot, Eli paused, reaching into his pocket. "I want you to have something," he said, pulling out a simple braided leather bracelet. "I made it for you." I stared at the bracelet, touched beyond words. "When did you make this?" "Last night," he admitted, "after I couldn't sleep." He took my wrist, his fingers gentle as he tied the bracelet securely. "Wear this," he said, his voice low and intense. "And if you ever want to leave, come find me up in the loft." I looked from the bracelet to his face, trying to understand the full meaning behind his words. "Eli, Just promise you'll wear it," he interrupted. "That's all I ask for now." "I promise," I said, running my fingers over the smooth leather. "I won't take it off." He nodded, satisfied, then glanced toward the path back to the farms. "I should go first. You follow in a few minutes." I agreed, though every part of me resisted the idea of him leaving. He began to move away, then turned back suddenly, capturing my lips in one last brief, burning kiss. "Tomorrow," he whispered against my mouth. "Tomorrow," I echoed. Then he was gone, slipping through the willow branches and disappearing down the path. I sank back onto the grass, my fingers tracing the bracelet on my wrist, my mind reeling with the enormity of what had just happened. The smell of him lingered on my clothes, the taste of him on my lips. My entire body hummed with a mixture of exhilaration and terror. Whatever was happening between us was beautiful, powerful, and impossibly dangerous. I stayed by the creek until I was certain Eli had reached the safety of his farm, then made my way back to Evelyn's house, my heart pounding with every step. The weight of the bracelet on my wrist felt like both a promise and a question. One I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. As I approached the farmhouse, I saw him in the distance, moving among the fields with his brothers, his straw hat firmly in place, his posture straight and proper. He looked exactly as he had that first morning, the perfect picture of an Amish farmer at work. But I knew better now. I knew the fire that burned beneath that calm exterior, the doubts that plagued his obedient heart, the sweetness of his lips against mine. and I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I was falling hopelessly, helplessly in love with him. I watched him for a moment longer before entering the house, my fingers still stroking the leather bracelet, my heart torn between two worlds, the one I'd left behind and the one I'd unexpectedly found in his arms.